a black pilot, fresh off a long week of flights, was ready to return home and finally relax. But when he stepped onto the plane, not as the captain this time, but as a passenger in first class, everything shifted. A flight attendant blocked his path, her polite smile hiding something colder underneath. "Sir, I think you're in the wrong section." What happened next unraveled in ways no one expected. Just minutes later, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom with an announcement that left the entire cabin in stunned silence. "Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear." Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if this resonates with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that matter. It all started with a boarding pass and a moment of doubt. But by the end of this flight, no one would look at the sky, or each other, the same way again. The terminal was alive, but the kind of life that bore little resemblance to the world outside. It was a space caught between places. No roots, no permanence, just movement, announcements, and the steady thrum of impatience. Jordan Matthews stood among it all, the weight of his carry-on in one hand and his boarding pass in the other. He could feel the stares, even when they weren't there. A sensation, like a second skin, woven over decades. Jordan was dressed in plain clothes, slacks pressed and shirt tucked in with the precision of a man accustomed to presenting himself in a world that demanded it. His pilot wings, heavy with 20 years of service, rested quietly in the small zippered compartment of his bag. He never wore them outside the cockpit. Not anymore. The gate agent called for first-class boarding. Her voice clipped and bright through the speakers. Jordan moved toward the counter. Not in a rush, but with the deliberate pace of someone who had nothing to prove, at least not outwardly. He handed over his ticket. The agent, a young woman with neat hair and tired eyes, took it with a smile that flickered for just a second. A pause too brief for most. But Jordan caught it. Her eyes scanned the ticket. And then him, as if reconciling two images that didn't belong together. First class. 2A. A lifetime of these small moments. And still, they never failed to land somewhere deep in the chest. "Enjoy your flight," she said, returning his ticket with a flash of that same polite smile. But Jordan had already left, moving toward the jet bridge with the quiet understanding that there would be more. There always was. The first-class cabin was half empty, bathed in the soft glow of recessed lighting. Jordan slipped into 2A, his window seat, and placed his bag overhead with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. He settled into the leather and glanced at the runway beyond the glass. He'd chosen this seat for the view. Old habits. Even as a passenger, the sky still called to him. The soft hum of boarding continued around him. A man in a gray suit and polished shoes passed by without a glance, his eyes fixed on the emails that glowed from his phone. A woman, carefully balancing a designer purse and latte, eased into 1C without so much as lifting her head. Jordan closed his eyes. For the first time in days, there was silence, and he let it wash over him. But silence, like comfort, was fleeting. "Excuse me, sir." His eyes opened to the sight of a flight attendant standing just inches from his seat. Her uniform crisp, name tag neatly pinned, Patricia. The smile she wore didn't quite fit, like a jacket borrowed from someone else. "This section is for first-class passengers," she said, lowering her voice as if to cushion the words. "I believe the main cabin is just beyond row 10. Jordan held her gaze for a moment, saying nothing, before reaching calmly into his pocket. He unfolded the boarding pass and handed it to her. Her eyes flickered downward, scanning the slip of paper with careful precision. 2A. The pause this time lasted longer, the weight of it pressing into the space between them. She shifted, adjusting her footing as though the ground beneath her had shifted too. "There must have been some mistake," she offered, though the evidence told another story. "No mistake," Jordan replied, voice even. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Passengers nearby glanced up, some subtle, others not. The man in 1D lowered his newspaper just enough to peer over the top. A woman a row behind Jordan whispered something to her seatmate. Patricia hesitated, her grip tightening slightly on the boarding pass before she handed it back. "Of course," she said, the words flat and brittle. Jordan took the slip of paper, folded it, and placed it back into his pocket. "Let me know if there's anything else," she added, but they both knew there wouldn't be. As she stepped away, Jordan turned his attention back to the window, the sky just beginning to blush with the last light of day. And somewhere in the soft hum of the cabin, he could feel it, like the distant rumble of turbulence yet unseen. Jordan had spent his life above the clouds, but the ground always found ways to pull him back. The plane had begun to fill. Businessmen with weary eyes, parents trying to corral restless children, and retirees exchanging quiet conversation as they navigated the narrow aisles. Each passenger carried their own weight, but none of them seemed to carry it quite the same way Jordan did. He glanced at the overhead bin, where his uniform hat sat tucked beneath his bag. Out of sight. Some things, he'd learned, were best left unseen. The hum of the engines whispered through the cabin as the final boarding calls echoed from the terminal. Jordan felt the shift in the air as the last few passengers shuffled in. The quiet settling over first class like dust on forgotten furniture. He was alone for now. But not for long. Patricia reappeared, this time with another flight attendant trailing just behind her. Sandra, according to the polished silver name tag. Older, with the posture of someone who had spent decades in the air and learned to bend without breaking. Jordan saw it in her eyes the moment they met him. "Sir, I'm Sandra, the senior attendant for this flight," she began, her voice warm but measured. "We just wanted to make sure everything was in order." It wasn't a question. Jordan felt the familiar prickle at the base of his neck. The kind that comes from knowing you are the only one being asked to explain your presence. "Everything seems fine to me," he replied, watching Patricia shift her weight beside Sandra. A pause stretched between them like a wire pulled too tight. "It's just that." Sandra hesitated, her words carefully placed. "Sometimes the system can make errors when issuing seat assignments." The system. Jordan almost smiled at the weightless way she said it, as if those words could neatly hold all the assumptions swirling beneath them. "Is that right?" he said, keeping his voice calm. Sandra nodded, offering a carefully curated smile. Jordan leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. "Then I suppose it's lucky that I'm exactly where I plan to be." Sandra's smile flickered. She hadn't expected resistance wrapped in courtesy. Jordan reached into the front pocket of his carry-on and pulled out his pilot's wings. The small metal insignia caught the cabin lights, glinting like a shard of glass. 20 years, he said, holding it up for just a moment before slipping it back inside. 10,000 flight hours. No errors in the system there. Patricia's gaze dropped to the floor, the color rising in her cheeks. Sandra, to her credit, held her ground. "Of course," she said, her tone softening. "I didn't mean to imply." "But you did," Jordan interrupted, gently but firmly. "And you're not the first." Sandra said nothing for a moment. The hum of the engines grew louder in the space between them. "I apologize," she said finally. Jordan nodded, accepting the words even if they landed a little too late. As Sandra and Patricia retreated toward the galley, Jordan felt the shift around him. Passengers in first class who had been eavesdropping now looked away, suddenly engrossed in their magazines or the idle scrolling of their phones. A man across the aisle, gray-haired and sunk deep into his leather seat, caught Jordan's eye and offered a tight smile. Jordan returned it, knowing exactly what it meant. "I see you." It wasn't pity, nor was it solidarity, just acknowledgement. The quiet exchange that black men recognized without speaking. Jordan closed his eyes, listening as the cabin door sealed shut. He had spent years watching the world from above, but no matter how high he flew, the ground had a way of reaching for him. It always did. The plane taxied slowly, as if even the ground beneath them sensed the weight in the air. Jordan could feel it pressing down. Not from the altitude but from the stillness. The kind that settled like dust when too many things were left unsaid. Sandra's apology had been polite, carefully sculpted, but it hung in the cabin like an unfinished sentence. He had heard apologies like that before, more for comfort than correction. Words designed to smooth the edges without truly reshaping the thing that caused the cut. He turned his head toward the window, watching the tarmac slip past. But he could feel the eyes behind him. They were there in the half-turn of heads, the flickers of curiosity, and the weight of those who tried a little too hard not to look. Jordan shifted, his hands resting lightly on the armrests, though every part of him remained coiled. Across the aisle, the gray-haired man from earlier leaned forward, catching Jordan's eye once more. This time, the smile was gone, replaced by something quieter, understanding. Maybe, or something that wore the same face. Jordan offered a slight nod, the smallest gesture, and then looked away. The thing about silence was that it always filled the space. And in rooms like this, rooms that flew but never really left the ground. It took shape in the form of glances, half-whispered comments, and the steady hum of things left unchallenged. Jordan thought about the wings tucked away in his carry-on, about how different the room would feel if he had worn them openly, pinned proudly to his chest as he walked to his seat. Would Patricia have stopped him then? Would Sandra have asked twice about the system's error? Would the man 2 rows ahead, the one glancing back now and again with quick, guilty looks, have bothered to whisper at all? But Jordan had left his wings in the bag. And that was the truth of the thing. The plane lifted, and the earth fell away beneath them. For a moment, Jordan let the sky take him. As it always had, the engines hummed low, vibrating gently beneath his seat. And for a fleeting breath, it felt like the world below couldn't reach him here. But then the curtain shifted. Patricia moved through the divide between first class and the main cabin. Her expression carefully neutral, she held a tray of drinks. Her hands steady now, though her shoulders betrayed the tension she was trying to hide. Jordan watched as she approached, noting how her steps slowed the closer she came. "Can I offer you something to drink, sir?" He caught the hesitation in her voice, the unspoken weight behind the word sir. "Water, no ice." He didn't say it aloud. Instead, he simply nodded, watching as she poured the glass and placed it gently on the tray in front of him. Patricia lingered for half a second longer than necessary. Jordan could see the words she wanted to say dancing just behind her lips. But she swallowed them down. And then she was gone, disappearing back behind the curtain as if the interaction had never happened. But the moment stuck. Jordan sipped the water, letting the coolness sit on his tongue longer than needed. It was a small thing. Really, a drink, a glance, a passing moment. But the small things had a way of stacking up. And Jordan had learned long ago that these were the moments that shaped a life. Not the storms. Not the sharp winds. But the slow, persistent drip of doubt. By the time the flight reached cruising altitude, Jordan could feel it. Not in the air around him, but in the space within him, where years of small things had gathered and grown heavy. And the sky, vast and empty as it was, suddenly felt smaller. There was a rhythm to flights. One Jordan knew well. The quiet hum at cruising altitude. The soft clatter of trays being cleared. The gentle descent that carried everyone toward a place they called home. But some descents were longer than others. Jordan's seat felt smaller now, though nothing around him had changed. The leather pressed against his shoulders, and the soft chatter from first class seemed louder than before. Sandra reappeared, moving with the effortless grace of someone who had spent her life in the air. She passed by Jordan without a glance, pausing instead at the seat directly behind him. "Can I get you anything else, Mr. Kensington?" she asked softly. Jordan didn't need to turn around to know which passenger it was. Kensington, the man who, only minutes ago, had made a point to request Patricia double-check the situation in the main cabin. "No, I'm fine," Kensington replied. His voice was casual now, as if his earlier suspicions had been nothing more than idle thoughts. Jordan listened as Sandra lingered for a moment longer, perhaps waiting for Kensington to acknowledge what had passed between them. But silence, once again, held the space. Jordan traced the rim of his water glass with his finger, feeling the slow, deliberate pull of frustration curling somewhere deep beneath his ribs. It was always the quiet ones. The men like Kensington, who never raised their voices but let their doubts settle in the cracks of polite conversation. The ones who smiled just enough to be disarming. Who prefaced their prejudice with phrases like "I'm sure it's nothing." But Jordan could handle the loud ones. The ones who made their distaste known without shame. At least with them, there was no pretense. No dance around what was already plain to see. But Kensington had whispered. And whispers traveled farther than shouts. Sandra returned, her gaze finally meeting Jordan's as she approached. She hesitated, the weight of unspoken words tugging at her features. "Captain Matthews," she began, keeping her voice low. "I just wanted to." Jordan stopped her with a slight raise of his hand. "Don't," he said gently, though his voice carried the unmistakable weight of someone too tired to collect apologies. "I know how this goes." Sandra's eyes softened. "Still," she added after a pause, "I want you to know I see it. I saw it then. And I see it now." Jordan met her gaze. And for a brief moment, there was no cabin between them. No title. No uniform. Just two people, caught in the quiet understanding of what the world often tried to ignore. "Thank you," he said, meaning it. Sandra nodded and stepped back toward the galley, leaving Jordan to the company of his thoughts. The descent began. The plane tilted slightly, and the faint tug of gravity signaled the slow return to Earth. Jordan watched the clouds thin beneath them, giving way to the city lights scattered far below. He wondered how many times Kensington had trusted someone like him to land a plane without ever knowing it. How many flights had ended with polite applause, never realizing the hands guiding them through storms looked nothing like what they'd imagined. Jordan let the thought linger as the plane sank lower, the runway lights coming into view, bright against the night. The irony of it all wasn't lost on him. He'd spent his life mastering the art of flying. But the hardest part was always the landing. The plane drifted lower, and with it came the inevitable return to the world below, a world Jordan Matthews knew all too well. It wasn't the flight that tired him. It never was. No. The exhaustion lived in the space between moments. In the slow descent back into a country that seemed to forget him as soon as his uniform came off. The cabin grew quieter as the flight attendants began their final checks. Patricia avoided his row, though Jordan could feel her presence linger like a shadow just beyond his vision. The other passengers, those who had watched the earlier exchange with quiet interest, now shifted uncomfortably, as if trying to distance themselves from the weight of what they had witnessed. But that weight had already settled, and no polite indifference could lift it. Jordan glanced toward the front of the cabin where Kensington sat, his hands folded neatly over his lap. The man had said nothing since his request for Patricia to make sure everything was in order. The accusation had been subtle, wrapped in silk, but the cut it left was unmistakable. Jordan knew that kind of cut. The kind that didn't bleed immediately, but lingered under the skin long after the moment had passed. He thought of his father, a man who had worked the railroads before they let him near the trains. His father had worn patience like armor, teaching Jordan that survival often meant smiling through clenched teeth. "Don't give them a reason to doubt you, son," he'd said once, adjusting the brim of his hat as he prepared for another day beneath the unforgiving southern sun. "They already doubt enough." Jordan hadn't understood then, not fully, but years later, sitting beneath the gaze of men like Kensington, he understood. It was never just about doubt. It was about who had the right to erase it. And who had to prove they belonged in the room. The seatbelt sign chimed. Jordan straightened in his seat, his hands resting lightly on his knees. A few rows ahead, Patricia's voice filtered through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbacks are upright. And tray tables are secured." Her voice carried the same calm professionalism it always did. But Jordan wondered if she felt the shift beneath the surface. The subtle ripple that now coursed through the first-class cabin. The thing about racism, Jordan had learned, was that it didn't need to raise its voice. It rarely shouted. It whispered. And in those whispers, it thrived. The businessman who didn't say his name but referred to him as Sir just a little too forcefully. The flight attendant who double-checked his ticket, not out of policy but out of instinct. The passenger who, despite hearing the pilot's announcement, still leaned over to ask Sandra if everything was really fine back there. Jordan had lived in those whispers his entire life. And yet, he hadn't grown numb to them. As the wheels touched the runway, Jordan exhaled. The return to solid ground always brought clarity, but rarely comfort. Outside, the tarmac stretched wide beneath the soft glow of airport lights. Inside, the cabin stirred to life as passengers reached for phones, bags, and the safety of routine. Jordan stayed seated. A part of him wondered if Kensington would look his way, if the man's eyes might finally meet him and acknowledge what had happened. But Kensington remained fixed on his phone, scrolling through emails that would never touch the edges of this moment. Jordan smiled faintly to himself. Not out of bitterness, but out of something deeper. Understanding. Men like Kensington didn't carry these moments with them. But Jordan did. And that was the difference. As the plane rolled to the gate, Jordan reached for his carry-on. His pilot's wings sat nestled in the side pocket. And for a brief second, he traced the outline with his fingers. A reminder that no matter how often the world doubted him, the sky never did. There was always a line, though few ever saw it. Jordan Matthews saw it every time he crossed an airport terminal. It was not drawn in ink or cordoned off with velvet ropes. No, this line lived in the space between the security checkpoint and the boarding gate. Between the expectation and the assumption. It whispered through the polished hallways of American life. Silent but omnipresent. And Jordan had learned to walk it carefully. But that day, the line shifted beneath his feet. As it often did when he was least prepared for it. Disembarking had been uneventful, but unease clung to him. Jordan felt the stairs passengers stealing glances as if piecing together the image of a black pilot with the dissonance of the earlier confrontation. Patricia had mumbled another apology as he passed. The words were quick, reflexive, but Jordan caught the flicker of shame in her eyes. She hadn't meant harm, but meaning rarely mattered to the people on the receiving end of assumptions. In the terminal, Jordan kept his head high, resisting the impulse to shrink into the crowd. But there was always someone. A security guard near baggage claim gave him a once-over dot, the kind that lingered a beat too long. Jordan kept walking. A middle-aged man in a pressed navy suit paused at the sight of him. The man's eyes flicked down to the wings now clipped to Jordan's shirt. As if their presence disturbed the natural order of things. Jordan offered a polite nod. The man did not return it. The line had shifted again. It happened next at the car rental counter. Jordan stepped forward, handing his license to the clerk. She was young, maybe in her early 20s. Her smile bright but guarded. Her eyes moved between his ID and his face, as if reconciling the two. Returning from a business trip? She asked. The question too casual to be harmless. Jordan paused, measuring his response. I'm a pilot, he replied simply, the weight of the words landing as softly as he could manage. The clerk's eyes flickered. For a second, Jordan thought she might challenge it. Oh, she said instead, handing him the keys. Safe travels. This was how the line worked. No outright denial, no blatant rejection, only the gentle probing of existence. As if his mere presence demanded explanation. Jordan had walked this line his entire life. And the thing about walking a line. Does that make you tired? By the time Jordan stepped into the airport cafe, his patience was running low. He found a seat by the window, where the hum of engines filled the space between sips of lukewarm coffee. Outside, planes taxied along the runways, oblivious to the small dramas unfolding inside. It was there, staring at the tarmac, that the day caught up with him. The weight of Kensington's condescension. Patricia's nervous apology. The clerk's subtle hesitation. Small things, yes. But small things accumulate, like stones in the pockets of a man treading water. Jordan thought of his father again. And the stories he never told. His father had lived under the same line, though perhaps it had been drawn with thicker ink in those days. Jordan wondered how often the man had swallowed his pride to make life easier for those around him. Jordan's thoughts were interrupted by a faint voice beside him. Excuse me, Captain? He turned to find a young black boy, no more than 10, standing awkwardly by his table. The boy's eyes were wide with curiosity, his hands tucked into the pockets of an oversized hoodie. My dad says you're a pilot, the boy said, glancing nervously toward a nearby table where his father sat watching with quiet pride. Jordan smiled, the weight in his chest lifting. If only slightly. I am, Jordan replied, offering his hand. The boy shook it carefully, as if afraid it might disappear. I didn't know pilots could. The boy hesitated, searching for the right words. Jordan understood. You can be anything, he said gently, Before the boy could finish. Don't let anyone tell you differently. The boy's eyes lit up. His father, still seated at the other table, offered a knowing nod. Jordan returned it. As the boy walked back to his father, Jordan watched them go, the line momentarily dissolving beneath their shared glance. It would return, as it always did. But for now, the sky felt just a little closer. The table was always there, just out of reach. Jordan Matthews had been circling it for most of his life. It wasn't a physical table. No mahogany edges to press his elbows against. No polished silverware to reflect his face. But it was their an unspoken gathering of power, of influence. And more often than not, the seat meant for him was missing. The next morning, Jordan arrived at the conference center early. It was a leadership summit. The kind of event where people in tailored suits shook hands with a little too much enthusiasm. Jordan adjusted his tie, acutely aware of how he filled the space. There weren't many men who looked like him in the room. There never were. The first panel began with little fanfare. 4 executives lined the stage, discussing innovation, growth, and leadership. Words like vision and synergy floated through the air, meaning everything and nothing at once. Jordan sat near the back, his hands folded over a notebook he hadn't yet opened. He listened, but his mind wandered. The faces on stage, polished and pale, spoke of progress. But their vision seemed confined to the narrow lanes they'd long traveled. Jordan had flown across continents, but still felt like he hadn't gone anywhere. He recognized this room, even if he'd never stepped foot in it before. The same conversations, the same panels, the same doors half opened but rarely inviting him through. It wasn't until lunch that the day began to shift. Jordan found himself at a round table near the center of the dining hall. A few other attendees joined him. 2 men in their late 50s and a woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. The conversation drifted toward business, mergers, acquisitions, the usual currents that carried men like them toward success. Jordan stayed quiet, watching, waiting. Halfway through the meal, the man seated across from him leaned in. "So, Jordan," he began, his tone light but probing. "What brings you here? I didn't catch your title earlier." Jordan smiled politely. "Captain Jordan Matthews. I'm a pilot." A flicker of surprise crossed the man's face, quick, but not quick enough to hide. "Ah," the man said, recovering. "Aviation. Fascinating. I guess leadership takes many forms." There it was. Jordan could see the calculation behind the man's eyes. The subtle downgrading of his presence at the table. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't even conscious. But it was there, just beneath the surface. Jordan had faced this particular storm before. "Leadership," Jordan replied calmly, "has to take many forms. The people in my cockpit expect nothing less." The woman beside him glanced up, interest flickering across her face. "Captain Matthews," she said, setting down her fork. "How long have you been flying?" 20 years, Jordan answered. 10,000 flight hours. There was a pause, a shifting of weight at the table. Something changed in the air. Jordan saw it happen. The recalibration. The room hadn't expected him to carry that kind of experience. The woman smiled knowingly, as if she'd been waiting for the rest of the table to catch up. "And how many passengers do you carry on an average flight?" she asked. Her voice light but leading. 200, Jordan replied, folding his hands again. "Give or take." The man across from him chuckled softly, shaking his head. "That's a lot of responsibility." He admitted. "It is," Jordan said simply, "which is why I'm sitting at this table." For a brief moment, silence stretched between them. But this wasn't the awkward silence Jordan had grown accustomed to. It was the kind of silence that precedes recognition. Later, as the summit wound down, Jordan lingered by the exit, shaking hands with a few of the attendees. The woman from lunch approached, holding a small business card between her fingers. "I'd like to keep in touch," she said. "Your perspective is valuable." Jordan accepted the card with a nod. "Thank you," he replied. She smiled. "Next time," she added, "don't wait for them to ask. Just take the seat." Jordan watched her walk away, the card cool in his palm. Some tables don't offer you a seat. But sometimes, you pull one up anyway. There is a point during every flight when the sky shifts from endless blue to something denser, heavier. The plane dips, and gravity pulls a little harder. Jordan Matthews knew this moment well. It was the descent. The part that brought you back down to where everything you left behind still waited. No matter how high you climbed, you always returned to the ground. His phone buzzed on the cab's armrest as he left the summit. A text from his daughter. How was the conference? He thought about how to answer. The summit had ended the way these things often do, with polite handshakes and vague promises of collaboration. Jordan had taken the woman's advice. By the afternoon, he wasn't waiting for invitations to speak. He leaned in. Yet, for every nod of respect, he still noticed the sideways glances, the fleeting moments of hesitation. The quiet suggestion that his seat was borrowed. Not permanent. It wasn't hostility. It was habit. Good, he finally replied. Productive. But that wasn't the whole truth. Jordan wasn't sure the truth could be neatly folded into a message. Later that evening, Jordan stood in his kitchen, washing the remnants of dinner from his plate. His daughter, Maya, sat at the table, flipping through a textbook. Law school had sharpened her. She asked harder questions now. He could feel one coming. Have you ever thought about quitting? She asked. Not looking up, Jordan's hands stilled under the water. Why would you ask that? Maya shrugged. I don't know. I hear your stories sometimes. And I wonder why you keep pushing through it all. Jordan dried his hands slowly. Because, he said carefully, if I don't, someone else will have to. Maya finally lifted her gaze. Maybe that's the problem, she said. Why does it always have to be you? Jordan didn't answer right away. He thought about the weight of it. The long, exhausting weight that people like him carried. The kind that pressed down without ever letting up. It doesn't, he admitted. But that doesn't mean I get to stop. The following week, Jordan returned to work. He walked through the airport, back in uniform, and like clockwork, the same people who had once questioned his presence in first class now opened doors without hesitation. The irony was sharp, but not surprising. Uniforms, after all, have a way of bending perception. Before takeoff, Jordan sat alone in the cockpit, performing the pre-flight checks. His co-pilot arrived, a young man with nervous energy and bright ambition. I read about you, the co-pilot blurted out as he settled into his seat. You're one of the few black captains in the fleet, right? Jordan kept his eyes on the instrument panel. Is that what you read? Well, the younger pilot hesitated, realizing the weight of his words. I just mean, it's impressive. You've made it pretty far. Jordan adjusted a dial, his tone steady. Farther than some, not as far as others. The co-pilot shifted uncomfortably, but Jordan didn't let him linger there. You'll learn, Jordan said, easing the tension. It's not about making it far. It's about making sure someone else can follow. The young man nodded, absorbing the lesson. By the time the plane lifted off, the sky stretched endlessly ahead. But Jordan didn't focus on the horizon. He thought about the descent. The part where everything below came back into view. He thought about Maya, about the tables he'd sat at, and the ones he'd yet to reach. The sky, no matter how far you climbed, was never permanent, but each time you returned to the ground, you brought a little more of it with you.